Hey, Indian Creek 8th grade students, it's Professor Blazek, and I'm back with another social studies video series. This time, we're going to be looking at the expansion west and the age of American industry. And this first video is going to be looking at the mining boom that took place during this time period in the western United States. And the guiding question that I would like you to keep in mind as you watch is, how did the mining boom impact America during the last half of the 1800s? Now, the mining boom began when gold was discovered in the town of Coloma, California in 1848. And thanks to this discovery, over 300,000 people would head west over the next few years to either pan or mine for gold, hoping to discover some of these riches that existed in the western United States. Now, in today's terms of money, there would be tens of billions of dollars in gold and other metals discovered in the West during this time period, just to show how much of an impact the money that was potentially out there had upon the people of America during this gold rush. Now, the gold rush would also help California become a state in the year of 1850. If you think back to our unit on the buildup to the Civil War, you will remember that California's statehood was an issue around this time period. But the discovery of gold and the amount of people who were moving out into the West, into California, would help seal the deal for California to join the Union at this time. Now, in addition, there were many small towns that would grow into large cities during the gold rush. One example would be San Francisco, which is now a major city in California today. But in the year of 1846, San Francisco only had a population of 200 people, while just 6 years later, in 1852, its population had expanded all the way to 36,000. So just one example of how quickly people were moving to the West and how this navigation of America's population could really help create these large cities in the Western United States. Now, thanks to the discovery of gold, Americans hoped that even greater riches would be discovered throughout the West, because the West was an area that really hadn't been explored, hadn't been settled. So Americans were hoping that the discovery of gold in California meant that there would be more precious metals to be discovered throughout the West. Again, just something that would help lift the spirits of Americans during this time period. Now, once a mine began producing gold, there would often be towns called boomtowns that would grow around these mining sites. And boomtowns would often pop up almost overnight because miners needed a place to stay. Mining companies needed to build the necessary buildings to keep a mine running. And other companies would grow because they knew that the miners and their families would need to help provide for themselves. So boomtowns were very common in the Western United States around mining sites. Now, these boomtowns were very lively. They were filled with diverse citizens because of all the different people who were moving out into the West to take part in the mining boom, but they were often lawless. And there was a very high cost of living in boomtowns, both because most of the people living there were gold miners who felt like they were getting rich very quickly, and they would spend a lot of their money on frivolous items that they probably wouldn't otherwise purchase, but because they were making money mining, they felt like that was part of their lifestyle, was buying these expensive items. In addition, again, because of all the money that was present in boomtowns, there was also a lot of gambling. And again, miners were hoping to just continue making money. But unfortunately, all of these things, more often than not, would drain the earnings of miners rather than expanding them. Violence was also very common in boomtowns because they were towns, again, that had really just popped up overnight. They did not have established law enforcement within them. And so because of the lack of law enforcement and the amount of money and guns that were present, violence was very, very common in boomtowns during this time. Now, boomtowns would really only last for as long as the mine was producing. Once a mine had dried up, the citizens of boomtowns would usually just leave and move to a different mining town, and this would leave the boomtowns to become ghost towns. So if you look at the two pictures included, you will see the top one is an example of a boomtown that has just been created around a mine that is producing some precious metal. The bottom picture is an example of just how empty these boomtowns would look once the mine had dried up and citizens had left them to become ghost towns. So just a very stark contrast between the two. Now, here are two more examples of boomtowns from this time period. The one on the left is a photograph from Deadwood, South Dakota in 1876, while the one on the right is from Virginia City, Nevada in 1859. And you will notice both of these boomtowns look very lively, but they also look like they have just basically popped up on the side of a hill or a mountain. And this is really what the case was more often than not with boomtowns, because they would be built around mining areas and would just sort of pop up out of nowhere. So this gives a much clearer picture of the boomtown kind of lifestyle and what the area looked like for these boomtowns. Now, the mining industry would need transportation during this time period because the rest of America's industries had remained in the East. It was really only the mining and to some extent the agriculture industries that would expand into the West. So the metals that were being mined didn't have their maximum value until they would reach factories where they could be refined and made into different items, or ports and markets where they could actually be bought and sold by consumers. On the flip side, miners themselves would also need food and other materials to survive that were being produced solely in the East. So transportation was needed to meet both of these concerns of the mining industry. And railroads would become the fastest and most reliable way to transport goods from the East to the West and the West to the East. And America's railroad track mileage would actually quadruple from the year of 1865 to the year of 1890, just showing how quickly the railroad industry expanded to meet the needs of those in the Western United States. Now, here's some maps just to show how quickly and drastically railroads in America expanded. You can see the map on the left from 1860 shows that most of the railroads in America are concentrated in the East and to some extent the Midwestern United States. Whereas by 1870, in the map on the right, there was a transcontinental line that had been completed that connected the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. And the national mileage had doubled to really cover the entire eastern and midwestern areas of the country. Now, continuing on into 1890, there would be railroads built to connect every single state and territory, and the railroads just continue to expand to the west. And then by 1890, the railroads had really covered a large amount of the West, and there were now multiple transcontinental lines that had been completed. So just looking at the railroad coverage of America from 1860 to 1890, this was a major, major expansion of a very important industry. Now, as I kind of touched on before, the country wanted to build a transcontinental railroad that would connect the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. This was like the major goal of the railroad industry during this time. So in 1863, one company began working in Nebraska and built to the west, while another company began working in California and built to the east. And just 6 years later, in 1869, these two companies met in Promontory Point, Utah. And there was a large ceremony that's pictured there in the bottom right. And this ceremony included the driving of a golden spike by California's Governor Leland Stanford. This ceremony took place on May 10th and really just symbolized a major accomplishment in the railroad industry, completing this line that connected America's two oceans. Now, there is a map to show you the line of the first transcontinental railroad. You can see one company began in Omaha, the other in Sacramento, the amount of land that they built through and where they met. And then you can see the actual golden spike that was driven by Leland Stanford pictured there on the right. It is now on display in a museum in celebration of the completion of this transcontinental railroad. Now, the completion of the transcontinental railroad would just continue to spur on future railroad growth across America. And by 1883, there were two more transcontinental lines that had been completed, in addition to the many smaller lines that were shown in those maps that we looked at earlier in this video. Now, the railroads would bring thousands of workers to the West to take part in the mining boom, and they would also carry the metals and produce from the West to the East, and then take the manufactured goods from the East industries into the American West. So these were the main purposes of the railroad in America during this time period. Now, towns would often grow around rail lines. In some cases, towns would even pay railroad companies to bring their tracks through the town because they knew that the railroads would bring in more people and then potentially more money. And in certain cases, these towns would actually grow into large cities thanks to all of the people and businesses that were brought into them by the railroad. So now you can see a map here shows the other transcontinental railroads that were completed during this time. One ran from New Orleans all the way into California, while the other began in Minnesota and ran all the way to Tacoma, which is a city in Washington. So just another visual example of the early transcontinental railroads in America. So we will end this video by looking again at our guiding question, which is how did the mining boom impact America during the last half of the 1800s? You can look back through the video to help you answer this question, and I will be back soon with part 2 in this series looking at the age of American expansion and American industry. Until then, this has been Professor Blazek, and I will see you next time.